The scream of the rotor stall warning wasn't just a sound you heard. It was a frequency that vibrated the fillings in your teeth, a mechanical shriek announcing that physics had officially given up on us. The world outside the plexiglass was a void of violent white, erased by the blizzard. But inside, the cockpit smelled of burned hydraulic fluid and sharp, metallic fear. I gripped the door handle, my knuckles white, watching Captain Mercer. She wasn't fighting the machine, she was negotiating with gravity. Her gloved hands moved with terrifying, surgical calm across the collective, ignoring the alarms screaming that we were falling. Then the skids hit the snowpack, a bone-jarring slam that snapped my head back against the seat, compressing my spine into the cushion. The engine whined down, a dying animal, and then darkness took over. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressing in on us like the mountain itself. To understand why that silence felt heavier than the crash, you have to understand the noise that usually filled the space between us. 6 hours earlier, the base locker room had been a study in atmospheric pressure. The industrial heater hummed in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the creeping frost of the hangar, while the air smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and the sharp chemical tang of floor cleaner. I was a whirlwind of scattered gear, adrenaline, and half-finished energy bars. My locker looked like a bomb had gone off inside a pharmacy. Saline bags tangled with carabiners, gauze rolls attempting to escape onto the bench, and my harness lying in a heap that defied the laws of geometry. 3 feet away, Captain Mercer was an island of terrifying precision. Her locker was a grid, flight helmet centered, gloves aligned like they were waiting for inspection, flight suit hung with military exactness. She stood with her back to me, the muscles in her shoulders shifting under her thermal shirt as she organized her navigation charts. It was a ritual, a protocol, and just watching her do it made my skin prickle with a mix of annoyance and something hotter, something I refused to name. We hadn't spoken since the hoist operation on Tuesday. That was the prior mission friction the rest of the crew whispered about. I had swung out on the line to grab a panicked skier before the wind shifted, a move that was technically successful but operationally reckless. Mercer hadn't yelled. Yelling I could handle. Instead, she had waited until we were on the ground, pulled me into the shadow of the tail rotor, and dissected my decision-making with a voice so low and cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. "You don't get paid to be a hero," she had said, her blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "You get paid to come back. If you compromise my aircraft again, you're grounded." That gaze. It was heavy, physical. It felt like a weight pressing against my chest every time she looked at me. Now, in the locker room, the silence stretched tight, a rubber band ready to snap. I dropped a roll of tape. It hit the concrete floor with a loud thwack, rolling across the invisible border into her territory. Mercer stopped moving. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished folding a map, placed it in her kneeboard, and then slowly pivoted. She looked at the tape, then at me. The look wasn't angry. It was exhausted patience. It was the look a statue gives a pigeon. She bent down, retrieving the tape with a fluid, controlled motion, and held it out. "Your equipment is drifting, medic," she said. Her voice was a low alto, vibrating through the quiet room. "Chaos in the locker room breeds chaos in the air." "It's just tape, Cap," I said, snatching it back. My fingers brushed hers, just for a microsecond. Her skin was cool, dry, rough from years of handling controls. The contact sent a jolt of static straight up my arm, shocking and immediate. It wasn't just a brush of fingers. It was a circuit closing. I pulled back, clutching the tape like a lifeline, my pulse spiking not from the caffeine, but from the sudden proximity. "Some of us work better with a little disorder." "Gravity doesn't care about your work style," she countered, turning back to her locker. "And neither does the storm front moving in." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell her that my chaos saved lives, while her protocols just managed them. But the bass klaxon cut me off. The sound was a physical blow. 3 sharp blasts that meant scramble. The tension in the room shattered, replaced instantly by the kinetic energy of the mission. Mercer transformed. The exhaustion vanished. She zipped her flight suit in one smooth motion, the sound of the zipper loud in the sudden quiet between alarms. She grabbed her helmet, her movements efficient, stripping away the human hesitation and replacing it with the pilot. "Ridgeline," she said, her voice clipping into command mode as she strode past me. "Climber with a broken femur. Weather is deteriorating. Move." I watched her walk toward the hangar doors, the confident, rhythmic stride of a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she controlled. I shoved my scattered gear into my bag, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the rescue. It was the terrifying realization that I would follow that woman into a hurricane if she asked, just to see if I could make her break protocol. The cockpit of the rescue helicopter isn't designed for personal space. It's designed for aerodynamics and survival. 2 things that apparently require human beings to be packed together like components in a circuit board. Climbing into the front seat beside Mercer felt less like entering a vehicle and more like putting on a garment we were forced to share. The air inside was a different climate entirely, a trapped pocket of cold that smelled aggressively of aviation fuel, worn leather, and the faint, lingering scent of ozone. I buckled in, the 4-point harness locking me against the seat with a rigidity that felt like a reprimand, compressing my chest until my breathing had to sync with the machine. Beside me, Mercer had already transformed. The moment her helmet slid on, the human woman who organized her locker with terrifying precision vanished, replaced by an extension of the airframe. I watched her hands move across the instrument panel, and it was a dance that made my mouth go dry. She didn't look at the switches. She knew the geography of the cockpit by touch alone. Her gloved fingers flipped toggles and adjusted dials with a rhythmic, hypnotic competence that was infuriatingly attractive. Click, click, hum. The overhead panel, the center console, the collective, she played the machine like a complex instrument, her movements economical and sharp. I tried to make myself small, pulling my elbows in, but the space was unforgiving. As I reached forward to adjust the transponder frequency, the helicopter shifted on its skids, a pre-flight shudder that threw my weight to the left. My knee knocked against hers. It wasn't a hard impact, just a brush of heavy flight suit fabric against fabric. But in the claustrophobic intimacy of the cockpit, it felt like a collision. I froze, waiting for her to pull away, to reestablish the invisible perimeter she guarded so fiercely. She didn't move. Her legs stayed planted against the center console, solid as a bulkhead, holding the contact. She was staring at the engine temperature gauges, her profile unreadable behind the dark visor of her helmet. But she didn't shift away from my touch. The vibration of the engine spooling up traveled through the floor, through the seats, and through that single point of contact between our knees, creating a shared frequency that rattled my teeth. "Clear right," she said, her voice not coming from the air next to me, but from inside my own head. That was the most dangerous part of the job, the comm system. The moment I plugged my helmet in, the world narrowed down to the static hiss of the open channel and the sound of her breathing. It was an intimacy that felt illicit. I could hear the sharp intake of her breath before she spoke, the low, steady cadence of her commands. It was a voice stripped of all the atmospheric noise, injected directly into my skull. It bypassed my ears and went straight to the nervous system. "Clear left," I replied, my voice sounding tinny and foreign in my own ears. "You're good to lift." The takeoff wasn't a gradual ascent. It was a rejection of gravity. The aircraft lurched, the skids leaving the tarmac with a stomach-dropping swoop that always made my heart hammer. The ground fell away in a blur of gray concrete and white snow, the familiar world shrinking until it was just a map below us. Usually, this was the moment my anxiety spiked, the moment the chaotic energy of the scramble peaked into panic. But then Mercer's hand adjusted the collective, a micro movement of her wrist that leveled us out with a smoothness that defied the wind buffering the fuselage. "Heading 350, she murmured, the static in the headset crackling like a warm fire. "It's going to be rough up there, medic. Keep your eyes outside." Her voice was calm, devoid of the tension that was currently vibrating through my limbs. It was an anchor, a heavy, steel weight that dragged me down from my panic and tethered me to the seat. I looked over at her. She wasn't looking at me. She never did when she was flying. But the connection was there, a taut wire running through the intercom, holding us together as we left the safety of the valley and banked hard toward the violence of the mountain winds. The arrival at the rescue site wasn't an event. It was a collision with reality. The weather report had promised deteriorating conditions, which is pilot speak for "the sky is going to try to kill you." As we crested the ridge, the world dissolved. The jagged peaks of the mountain range were swallowed by a swirling vortex of gray and white, a blinding whiteout that erased the horizon line and turned the concept of up into a suggestion rather than a fact. The wind here wasn't just moving air. It was a solid physical force, slamming into the fuselage with the weight of a freight train. The helicopter bucked violently, a sudden, sickening drop that left my stomach somewhere back at 5,000 feet. But Mercer caught it. I felt the correction in the frame of the aircraft before I saw it, a sharp, decisive countermove that wrestled the machine back into submission. "Target at 2 o'clock, Mercer's voice crackled, calm and flat, cutting through the screaming gale outside. "I can't see the deck. You are my eyes, medic. Talk to me." "Copy," I replied, unbuckling the safety harness and clipping into the monkey tail, the retention strap that was the only thing stopping me from becoming a permanent part of the landscape. I slid the cargo door open, and the sensory assault was immediate and brutal. The cockpit's pressurized warmth was ripped away, replaced instantly by a freezing hurricane that bit into every millimeter of exposed skin. The rotor wash, usually a rhythmic thumping, was magnified here by the canyon walls into a deafening roar, kicking up a cloud of snow that stung my face like buckshot. I leaned out onto the skid, the metal slippery with ice, my boots finding purchase on the narrow step. Below me, 50 feet of churning nothingness separated us from a narrow ledge where a splash of bright red Gore-Tex marked the climber. This was the moment. This was the dance. In a hover, the pilot is blind to what's directly beneath the aircraft. Mercer was flying entirely on faith, trusting my voice to guide her hands. I looked back into the cockpit. Through the swirling snow and the plexiglass, I saw her. She wasn't looking at the gauges. She wasn't looking at the horizon. Her head was turned slightly, her visor angled toward me. She was watching my hand signals, her body tense, her gloved hands gripping the cyclic and collective with a white-knuckled intensity that belied the smoothness of the aircraft's movement. "Left 10, I shouted into the mic, my voice fighting the wind. "Down 5, hold, hold." The helicopter shifted instantly, responding to my commands as if my voice was wired directly into the hydraulics. It was a terrifying, heady rush of power. For all her rank, for all her stoicism and protocols, in this moment, she belonged to me. She moved when I said move. She held when I said hold. The connection between us was a taut, vibrating wire, more tangible than the steel cable of the winch. I could feel her focus wrapping around me, a protective field that held the chaotic forces of the storm at bay. She was fighting a 40-knot crosswind that wanted to smash us into the cliff face, making thousands of micro adjustments a second to keep the skid steady enough for me to work. And she was doing it for me. I lowered the penetrator, watching the steel cable unspool into the white abyss. The wind grabbed it, swinging the heavy weight like a pendulum. But Mercer anticipated the sway. She danced the aircraft in the opposite direction, a countermove so subtle it felt like telepathy, canceling out the momentum before it could become dangerous. "Cable on deck," I called out. "Load is heavy. Prepare for torque spike." The recovery was messy. It always is. The climber was panicked, thrashing against the straps, dead weight in the worst possible way. As the winch took the load, the helicopter groaned, the engine pitch screaming higher as it fought the sudden drag. I hauled the basket up, muscles burning, fighting the wind that tried to spin the patient like a top. I locked eyes with Mercer again. She was fighting the pedals, her boots dancing to counteract the torque, sweat visible on her neck even in the freezing cold. She was an absolute anchor in a sea of chaos, a point of fixed certainty that allowed me to do my job. I wrestled the basket onto the floor of the cabin, the climber groaning in pain, and slammed the door shut, sealing out the roar of the storm. The silence that rushed back in was sudden and ringing. "Patient secure!" I yelled, collapsing back into my seat, chest heaving. "Let's get the hell out of here." "Copy," Mercer said. "Departing." She pulled pitch to climb out, but the machine didn't respond with its usual surge of power. Instead, a violent shudder ripped through the airframe, a mechanical cough that rattled the entire cockpit. The smooth whine of the turbine faltered, replaced by a grinding metal-on-metal screech that sounded like the end of the world. The master caution light exploded into life on the dashboard, a terrifying red eye blinking in the gloom, and the stomach-dropping sensation of lift vanished, replaced by the sickening, weightless lurch of a fall. The red light on the dashboard wasn't just a warning. It was a verdict. "Hydraulic pressure," Mercer said, her voice cutting through the screaming, chaotic noise of the cockpit with a terrifying, flat calm. "I'm losing the servo." The helicopter didn't just fall. It fought us. Without the hydraulic boost, the cyclic stick, the control that effectively steered the rotor, went from being a precision instrument to a bucking, wild animal. The feedback forces from the spinning blades slammed back through the mechanical linkage, trying to rip the control grip out of Mercer's hands. I saw the change in her posture instantly. The fluid, hypnotic dance of her pre-flight checks vanished, replaced by a brutal, static display of raw, physical strength. Her biceps bunched hard beneath the thick Nomex of her flight suit, the fabric straining across her shoulders as she wrestled the machine, forcing the stick forward with both hands to keep the nose down. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" she broadcast, the rhythm of her voice never wavering, never speeding up. "Rescue 16 is going down. Hydraulic failure. Attempting emergency landing on the plateau. Coordinates to follow." I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edges of my seat until my fingers went numb. My job was done. The patient was strapped in, the door was locked. Now, I was just cargo. I was a passenger in a metal box falling out of the sky at 2,000 feet per minute. And the only thing standing between me and a crater in the snow was the woman sitting 2 feet to my right. In that moment, staring at her profile illuminated by the strobing red glare of the warning lights, the resentment I thought I felt, the annoyance at her rules, her coldness, her rigid protocols, evaporated. It was burned away by a sudden, overwhelming flash of awe. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't bargaining with God. She was doing math. She was calculating airspeed, rotor RPM, and descent rate while fighting a stick that was trying to break her wrists. I watched a droplet of sweat track down her temple and disappear into the padding of her helmet. I watched the way her jaw set, a hard line of determination that made her look like she was carved from the same granite as the mountain we were about to hit. It wasn't a crash. A crash is chaotic. A crash is a surrender. This was a controlled failure. It was a violent, terrified negotiation with physics. The stomach-dropping sensation of freefall clawed at my throat, a primal biological scream that told me I was dying. But Mercer refused to let the aircraft tumble. She kept the nose level, bleeding off airspeed to gain a fraction of lift, trading our forward momentum for a few precious seconds of survival. "Brace," she commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact. The ground didn't approach, it erupted up at us. 1 second, there was only the swirling gray void of the storm, and the next, the jagged texture of the snowpack filled the windshield. Mercer pulled back on the cyclic, a massive, heaving motion that required her entire body weight. She flared the aircraft, pitching the nose up to arrest our descent at the very last second. The impact was a car crash times 10. First, the skids hit, a deafening, bone-jarring crunch that felt like it compressed my spine into a fine powder. The aircraft bounced, slewed sideways violently as the tail rotor clipped adrift, and then slammed down again, hard and final. The world outside dissolved into a white explosion of flying snow and ice. My helmet smacked against the side window, a sharp bloom of pain, and the seatbelt bit into my collarbone like a saw blade. Then, the noise changed. The high-pitched whine of the turbine began to spool down, a dying, mournful whistle that dropped in pitch until it was just a groan. The rotor blades slowed, whomp, 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 cutting through the air with decreasing violence until they shuddered to a halt. And then, silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the absence of life support. The hum of the avionics, the vibration of the engine, the hiss of the heater, it was all gone. We were sitting in a dead machine, buried in a snowbank at 8,000 feet, while the wind howled outside like a living thing trying to claw its way in. I stared at the instrument panel. The red master caution light was still glowing, a singular, unblinking eye in the sudden gloom. We were down. We were alive. But looking out at the wall of white pressing against the plexiglass, I realized the crash was just the beginning. The pilot had saved us from the fall, but now the mountain was going to try to finish the job. I didn't wait for an all clear. I unbuckled with hands that were shaking so badly, I fumbled the release twice. My body flooded with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and shock. I scrambled out of the co-pilot seat and practically fell into the cargo bay, my knees hitting the metal floor hard. The climber was still strapped to the litter, eyes wide and terrified, but breathing. I checked his pulse, rapid, thready, but present. He was alive. We were all alive. "Engine shutdown complete," Mercer said from the front. Her voice was quieter now, lacking the electronic amplification of the intercom. It sounded small in the sudden, suffocating silence of the dead machine. "Battery master off." Then, the cold arrived. It didn't seep in, it invaded. With the turbine dead and the heater silent, the thin aluminum skin of the helicopter offered about as much insulation as a soda can. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted, matching the freezing vortex outside within minutes. My breath started to fog in front of my face, white plumes of vapor that ghosted over the patient's chest. "Mercer," I called out, my voice cracking. "We need to conserve heat. We can't stay in the front." She didn't answer immediately. I looked up to see her sitting motionless in the pilot's seat, her hands still resting on the cyclic, as if she could will the aircraft back into the sky by sheer force of habit. Then, slowly, she raised her hands to her helmet. She undid the chin strap and pulled it off. I had seen Captain Mercer every day for 6 months. I knew the shape of her jaw, the color of her eyes, the exact shade of blonde her hair was when she pulled it into a regulation bun. But I had never seen her like this. Without the helmet, without the visor, the stoic pilot evaporated. Her hair was damp with sweat, plastered to her forehead in messy, unregulation strands. There were deep red indentations on her cheeks from the helmet pads, marks of the violence she had just endured to keep us alive. She turned to look at me, and for the first time, her eyes weren't scanning instruments or assessing risks. They were just open. She looked exhausted. She looked human. And in the dim blue emergency lighting of the cabin, she looked strikingly, painfully beautiful. "You're right," she said, her voice rough. She unbuckled and climbed over the center console, moving with a stiffness that told me the landing had battered her just as badly as it had me. We worked in a frantic, silent rhythm. Survival protocol. We broke out the emergency kit, unfurling the foil survival blankets that crinkled loudly in the quiet. We draped one over the patient, tucking it in tight, effectively cocooning him. But the cold was relentless. The metal floor was a heat sink, sucking the warmth straight out of our bodies. My teeth started to chatter, a humiliating, uncontrollable rhythm that I couldn't suppress. "We need to consolidate," Mercer said. She was shivering too, a subtle tremor running through her shoulders. "Body heat. It's the only heat source we have left." We sat on the floor of the cargo bay, wedged between the patient's litter and the bulkhead. It was a space designed for equipment bags, not two full-grown women in flight gear. We wrapped 2 survival blankets around us, creating a makeshift tent, a shimmering silver dome against the dark. "Come here," she ordered. It wasn't a request, but the command lacked her usual sharpness. It was a necessity. I shifted closer, closing the distance until there was no space left. I pressed my side against hers, my shoulder tucking under the curve of hers, my hip aligning with her hip. The contact was shocking. Even through the thick, fire-resistant layers of our flight suits, her heat was immediate and overwhelming. It was a solid, grounding weight that anchored me to the floor. Mercer stiffened for a second, a reflex of her rigid personal boundaries. And then she exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and melted. She leaned into me. Her arm came up, wrapping around my shoulders to pull the blanket tighter, effectively pulling me into her. My head found the space between her shoulder and her neck, a perfect, dangerous fit. The sensory details of the cockpit had been mechanical: fuel, metal, ozone. But here, huddled under the foil, the world narrowed down to the smell of her. She smelled of cold air, stale coffee, and the sharp, salty tang of fierce sweat. It was raw and incredibly intimate. I could feel the rise and fall of her chest against my arm, the slow, deliberate cadence of her breathing as she forced her heart rate down. I closed my eyes, focusing on that rhythm, letting it replace the memory of the screaming alarms. We were stranded in a blizzard, trapped in a broken machine on the side of a mountain. But as her warmth seeped into my frozen limbs, I realized with a terrifying clarity that I had never felt safer in my life. "So," I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in the small space under the foil. I tried to summon my usual deflection, the humor I used as a shield against her stoicism. "Is this part of the standard operating procedure, Cap? Mandatory cuddling at 8,000 feet? I must have missed that page in the flight manual." Mercer didn't bite. She just stared straight ahead at the dim outline of the cargo netting, her jaw set in a line of tension that felt brittle enough to snap. "I lost the airframe," she said quietly. It wasn't a conversation, it was a confession. "The servo failed, but I should have felt the vibration earlier. I should have put us down on the lower plateau before we lost the hydraulics completely." "You put us down in a blizzard without killing us," I countered, the humor draining out of me. "That wasn't a failure, Mercer. That was a miracle." "It was sloppy," she murmured, turning her head slightly. In the blue wash of the emergency light, her profile was sharp against the shadows. My job isn't to perform miracles, medic. It's to manage risk. I risked the crew. I risked the patient. You're terrified, I realized aloud. The words slipped out before I could filter them. Mercer flinched, a microscopic tightening of the muscles around her eyes. I am responsible, she corrected. No, I said, shifting under the blanket so I could face her more fully. The movement brushed my leg against hers, a friction that sent a fresh wave of heat through the cold. You're scared. You think if you stop being perfect for 1 second, the whole world falls out of the sky. She didn't argue. She didn't deflect. She just exhaled. A long, shaky sound that vibrated in my chest. The professional distance she maintained so rigorously had shattered along with the landing skids. The truth hung in the air between us, heavy and exposed. We were stripping each other down, layer by layer, right there in the freezing dark. Then, the dynamic shifted. Mercer pulled one hand free from the blanket. It was bare now, her glove discarded somewhere in the darkness. She reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed her palm against my cheek. The contact was a shock to the system. Her hand was warm, calloused from the cyclic, and incredibly gentle. It was the touch of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply. You're still shivering, she murmured. Her thumb brushed across my cheekbone, tracing the skin. Is it the cold, or is it shock? I don't know, I whispered. My breath hitched, a jagged sound in the quiet. Let me check, she said. She slid her hand down from my cheek to the side of my neck, her fingers pressing into the hollow of my throat to find my pulse. It was a medical gesture, something I had done 1,000 times to patients, but this wasn't medical. Her fingers lingered. She wasn't counting beats, she was feeling the rhythm. Her touch was heavy, grounding, a physical anchor that held me in place while the rest of the world spun. I felt my pulse spike under her fingertips, a frantic, betraying rhythm that had nothing to do with hypothermia. She felt it too. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and dark, searching. The air in the small space thickened, charged with a sudden, suffocating density. The survival instinct was being replaced by a different kind of hunger. Your heart rate is elevated, she noted softly, but she didn't pull her hand away. Her thumb stroked the sensitive skin of my neck, a slow, hypnotic movement that made my eyelids flutter. Adrenaline, I lied, my voice barely a breath. Is it? She asked. She leaned in closer. The distance between us evaporated until I could feel the warmth of her breath against my lips. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then snapped back up to my eyes, unflinching and intense. It was the look of a pilot assessing a new, dangerous variable. Mercer, I breathed, her name feeling like a plea. She tilted her head, her hand tightening slightly on the back of my neck, pulling me a fraction of an inch closer. The tension was a physical thing, a coiled spring waiting to release. I wanted her to close the gap. I wanted her to break the last protocol. Then, a sound cut through the intimacy like a knife. Thwup, thwup, thwup. Distant, rhythmic, and unmistakable. The heavy beat of rotor blades cutting through the storm. Mercer froze. The spell shattered. Her hand dropped from my neck instantly, the loss of her touch leaving my skin stinging with cold. She turned her head toward the fuselage wall, the pilot re-entering her body. Search and rescue, she said, her voice flat and professional again. They found us. The rescue wasn't a relief. It was a violent extraction. The sliding door of our broken aircraft was ripped open from the outside, and the world flooded back in. Blinding searchlights, the deafening roar of a second rotor overhead, and the chaotic shouting of the rescue swimmers. The private, suspended reality we had created under the survival blanket was torn apart by the efficiency of the extraction team. Miller, the lead swimmer from Rescue 2, hauled the patient out first, then reached for me. I didn't want to move. My body was still humming with the frequency of Mercer's touch, my skin burning where her fingers had rested on my neck. But the protocol doesn't care about lingering moments. I was pulled out into the swirling snow, clipped into a hoist, and yanked into the sky, leaving the broken shell of our helicopter and the intimacy it had forced behind in the dark. Inside the rescue bird, the atmosphere was sterile. It was a larger airframe, loud and crowded with gear. I was shoved into a jump seat against the bulkhead, strapped in by a crew chief who looked at me with pity. Mercer was seated opposite me, and that's when the withdrawal hit. It was instantaneous. The moment she was back in a functional aircraft, surrounded by other professionals, the armor slammed back into place. She pulled a spare headset over her ears, effectively sealing herself off from the ambient noise and from me. She didn't look at me. She stared out the porthole window at the passing darkness, her profile illuminated by the strobing anti-collision lights. Her jaw was clenched tight, the muscles working rhythmically as she ground her teeth. She was already debriefing herself. She was replaying the crash, analyzing the hydraulic failure, cataloging her errors. The woman who had touched my face, who had looked at me with raw, terrified hunger, had been left on the mountain. In her place sat Captain Mercer, stoic, remote, and unreachable. I sat there, shivering in my flight suit, feeling a phantom limb sensation where her warmth had been. The distance between our knees was only a few inches, but it felt like an ocean. She was a fortress, checking the airspeed indicator over the pilot's shoulder, critiquing the flight path. The landing at the base was a spectacle. We touched down on the main apron, and the world was blue flashing lights and fire trucks. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft before the rotors even stopped turning. The door opened, and the noise of the base, the shouting, the vehicles, the wind, rushed in. Mercer was out of her seat instantly. She moved with a stiff, bruised efficiency, ignoring the medic who tried to grab her arm. She walked straight toward the maintenance chief, who was waiting by the nose of the aircraft. I watched her go. She didn't look back. Not once. She was pulled into the orbit of command and logistics, disappearing into a knot of high-ranking officers and mechanics. I was herded in the opposite direction, toward the medical bay. I answered the questions on autopilot. Yes, I'm fine. No, nothing is broken. But my eyes kept darting to the hangar doors, searching for a blonde ponytail and a flight suit. Nothing. She was gone. The separation was absolute. I was sitting on a gurney, staring at my boots and trying to stop my hands from shaking when the base PA system crackled to life. It wasn't the usual scramble tone. It was a direct summons, the voice of the base commander cutting through the hangar's echo like a gavel. Captain Mercer and Medic Vance, report to the briefing room immediately. The principal's office. The Inquisition was starting, and I had no idea which version of Mercer was going to walk through that door. The briefing room was a sensory vacuum, the polar opposite of the mountain we had just survived. Where the cockpit had been dark, freezing, and intimate, this room was aggressively bright, sterile, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing frequency that bounced off the whiteboards and the polished linoleum. It smelled of dry erase markers, burnt coffee, and the suffocating weight of bureaucracy. Base Commander Stone sat behind the long laminate table, a wall of monitors behind him, displaying the telemetry data from our flight. The jagged red lines on the screen were a digital autopsy of our near-death experience. Around the perimeter of the room, the rest of the flight crew, the relief pilots, the mechanics, the other medics, stood in silence, a jury of our peers watching the execution. Captain Mercer stood at attention in the center of the room. She had cleaned up, but the exhaustion was etched into the lines around her eyes. Her posture was rigid, her face a mask of absolute, unreadable discipline. She wasn't the woman who had held me under the survival blanket. She was Rescue 16, and she was currently taking a beating. You pushed for another 3 miles, Captain, Stone said, tapping a pen against a stack of printouts. His voice was dry, devoid of empathy. You took the aircraft into a red zone, unnecessarily. I made a calculated risk to clear the ridge, sir, Mercer replied, her voice flat. The terrain below the initial spike was unstable. I judged it safer to push for the plateau. You judged wrong, Stone snapped. You lost the airframe. You risked the crew. You risked a civilian. That isn't judgment, Mercer. That's arrogance. I watched Mercer's jaw tighten. She didn't argue. She didn't explain the wind shear or the whiteout blind spots. She just nodded, absorbing the blame like a sponge to keep the rest of us dry. Yes, sir. It was pilot error. I accept full responsibility. The injustice of it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I felt the heat rising up my neck, a sudden, volatile spike of anger that burned through the lingering shock of the crash. She was standing there, letting him dissect her, letting him reduce the most incredible piece of flying I had ever seen into a statistical failure. She was protecting the protocol, protecting the team, protecting me from the scrutiny. I looked at her hands, clenched into fists at her sides. Those were the hands that had fought a dying machine to the ground. Those were the hands that had warmed my skin when I was freezing. The disconnect between the hero in the cockpit and the scapegoat in this room was too much. The silence in the room felt heavy, judgmental, and wrong. Excuse me, sir, I said. The interruption was quiet, but in the dead silence of the room, it sounded like a gunshot. Stone looked up, annoyed. Mercer's head snapped toward me, her eyes widening slightly, a silent command to stand down, flashing in her gaze. I didn't stand down. I stepped forward, moving into the center of the room until I was standing shoulder to shoulder with her. The proximity made my skin prickle, the phantom warmth of her body ghosting against my side. With all due respect, I continued, my voice gaining traction, the telemetry doesn't tell you the whole story. You're looking at data points. You weren't in the seat. Medic Vance, Stone warned, his eyes narrowing. This is a flight review. You are not a pilot. No, I'm not, I agreed, turning to look directly at Mercer. She was staring at me, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the panic underneath. I'm the cargo. I'm the person whose life depends on the decisions made in that front seat. And if you think that landing was arrogance, you need to recalibrate your definition of the word. Vance, Mercer hissed, a low warning. I ignored her. I turned back to Stone, the words spilling out of me, fueled by a mixture of exhaustion and a terrifying clarity. You talk about the manual, sir. The manual says we should be dead. The physics say we should be a crater on the side of that mountain. The only reason we aren't is because Captain Mercer doesn't just fly by the book. She flies by instinct. The room was dead silent now. I could feel the eyes of the entire squadron on us. It wasn't just protocol, I said, my voice shaking slightly. It was a conversation with the machine. I watched her fight that stick for 4 minutes straight. I watched her calculate descent rates while her hydraulics were trying to break her wrists. She didn't panic. She didn't hesitate. She became the aircraft. I took a breath, and the professional veneer I was trying to maintain slipped. The emotion I had been suppressing since the crash, the intensity of that moment under the blanket, surged to the surface. I trust her, I said, and my voice dropped to a hush that carried to every corner of the room. I don't trust the regulations. I don't trust the weather reports. I trust her. Because when the world went white and the engine died, she was the only thing that felt real. She's the only one who sees the chaos and knows exactly how to hold it together. Mercer's head turned slowly. She wasn't looking at the commander anymore. Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching in a way only I could hear. I don't just trust her with my life, sir, I finished, the realization hitting me mid-sentence, turning the defense into a confession. I need her, because she's the only one who makes me feel safe. She's the only one I want flying me. It was a clumsy save, but the damage was done. The air in the room had shifted. It wasn't a briefing anymore. It was an exposure. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of discipline. It was the stunned, heavy silence of 50 people realizing they had just witnessed something incredibly private. Mercer stared at me, and for the first time, the Stoic pilot looked completely, utterly disarmed. The briefing ended with a murmur, not a bang. Commander Stone cleared his throat, the sound distinct in the thick silence, and muttered something about reviewing the tapes and pending disciplinary action. But the words lacked teeth. He knew the room had turned. He dismissed us with a wave of his hand that felt more like a surrender than a command. I didn't wait for the dismissal to settle. I turned on my heel and walked out, my boots hitting the linoleum with a tempo that was just shy of a run. I needed air. I needed darkness. I needed to escape the 50 pairs of eyes that were currently dissecting my soul. I pushed through the double doors into the main hangar, the vast, cavernous space swallowing me whole. It was colder here, the air heavy with the smell of grease, aviation fuel, and the metallic tang of cooling engines. I walked toward the far wall, aiming for the shadows behind the maintenance scaffolding of a disassembled Black Hawk. "Vance." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hangar's echo like a frequency jammer. It was the same tone she used when the engine failed. Absolute, unavoidable. I stopped. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a chaotic counterpoint to the steady, deliberate sound of her boots approaching on the concrete. Click. 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 "Look at me," she commanded. I turned slowly. Mercer was standing 10 feet away, illuminated by the harsh sodium floodlights high above. She looked wrecked. The Stoic pilot who had weathered a blizzard and a hydraulic failure looked like she was vibrating apart. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her chest was rising and falling in a ragged rhythm. She closed the distance, her stride long and predatory, until she was standing inside my personal space, the same distance we had shared under the survival blanket, but without the excuse of the cold. "That speech," she said, her voice low and rough. "In there. Did you mean it?" I was defending a superior officer, I deflected, stepping back until my shoulders hit the cold metal of a tool chest. "It was—" "Don't," she cut me off, stepping closer, effectively pinning me against the chest. She placed a hand on the metal on either side of my waist, boxing me in. The smell of her, ozone, sweat, and that distinct, sharp scent of adrenaline filled my lungs. "Not after you just stripped me bare in front of the entire command staff." "Did you mean it?" I looked up at her. The blue eyes that usually scanned horizons were locked onto mine, dilated and dark. She wasn't looking for a flight path. She was looking for a landing zone. "Yes," I whispered, the truth bleeding out. "I meant it. I trust you. I want you flying me. I want you." Mercer let out a breath that sounded like a shudder. The tension that had held her spine straight for 6 months, the titanium reinforcement of her character, finally snapped. "Good," she growled, "because I am done following protocol." She didn't ask. She didn't hesitate. She crashed her mouth against mine with the same desperate, calculated intensity she used to fight the storm. It wasn't a sweet kiss. It was a collision. It was a claiming. Her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, erasing the very concept of distance. She tasted like coffee and survival. It was overwhelming, a sensory overload that grounded me instantly. For the first time, the chaos in my head went silent. There was only her. The grip of her hands, the heat of her body, the absolute, undeniable reality of being held by the only person who could fly through a hurricane and bring me home. We sat on the tailgate of the maintenance truck, watching the sun burn the mist off the peaks. The storm had broken, leaving the world sharp and brilliant. Mercer wasn't looking at the sky. She was leaning against me, her head resting heavily on my shoulder, her fingers laced tightly with mine, a quiet, permanent knot. "The forecast is clear," she murmured, squeezing my hand. If you've ever found your anchor in the middle of a disaster, subscribe to see where we fly next.